Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Alex Roberts, and I am so happy to be hosting tonight's episode of Democratic Television, where we discuss current issues that connect with Democratic ideals. On tonight's show, I and a very distinguished panel of guests will be discussing the sensitive subject of immigration. We will have a narrow focus on three specific issues that are affecting Knoxvillians and really the state of Tennessee as a whole. These issues include the very controversial and newly approved 287G program, which deputizes members of the Knox County Sheriff's Department as official immigration and customs enforcement agents, or ICE agents. We will also be discussing the failure, once again, unfortunately, of tuition opportunity legislation, which would grant in-state tuition funds to the children of undocumented immigrants. And in many cases, these children have lived in the state of Tennessee the majority of their lives, but still do not have access to this in-state tuition. And finally, we'll be discussing the state of Tennessee's decision, along with 9 additional states, to effectively sue the federal government if the DACA program, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, is not ended, which would really be catastrophic to so many lives, and we would hate to see that happen. So these are very serious and important issues and very timely, and that's why I'm so happy to have on a panel of guests that are so knowledgeable and passionate about these topics. To my immediate left here is Dr. Megan Conley from AKIN, which stands for the Allies of Knoxville's Immigrant Neighbors. She's also the Director of Community Partnerships in the Department of Sociology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So we're happy to have you on. Next to her is a local educator and a member of Kindred Futures, which is a group of educators working to ensure quality education and safe learning environments for immigrant and refugee students, Ms. Karen Ladis. Happy to have you on.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then next to her is Carla, who is a longtime tax-paying resident of Tennessee, and in particular Knoxville, and was actively involved in the effort to pass tuition opportunity legislation. She's also a co-chair of AKIN. So thank you for being on as well. So again, these are very important issues and timely. So we only have a short time tonight to discuss these very complex issues. So let's just dive right into it. The first question goes to you, Megan, and this is regarding the 287G program. Could you give us just a brief background on the history of this 287G program here in Knoxville?
Sure. 287G has a long and sordid history in Knoxville and Knox County. It's a program that deputizes local law enforcement to act as immigration agents. And our sheriff, J.J. Jones, first applied for the program in 2009.
Okay.
Now, he came up for review for the program in 2012, which is when our group, Allies of Knoxville's Immigrant Neighbors, found out about it. And at that time, immediately we were concerned. The 287G program was a program that was being investigated for a variety of civil rights violations around the country for a variety of reasons. And our sister county, Davidson, Nashville, had 287G and had a history of some civil rights violations that we were deeply concerned about, and I'm happy to talk more about those. So we first tried to get a meeting with the sheriff. We went 14 months before we were able to meet with him.
Really, 14 months?
14 months. During that time, spoke with media, we sent letters, we sent a variety of delegations to the sheriff's office, all as a way of saying, we are constituents, we are concerned, and as your constituent, we feel that we have a right to meet with you and express our concerns.
Right.
2013, the sheriff learned that his application had been rejected, which we were quite happy with, and it was at that point that the sheriff made the controversial statement that many of us will remember, that he intended to enforce federal immigration laws with or without the help of federal immigration agents, which is illegal. And then the more repeated line is that he intended to stack violators like cordwood in the Knox County Jail.
Right, I remember that comment.
Yes. So everything died down for a little while, and then we learned, maybe it was February, maybe March of this year, that our sheriff had reapplied for 287G, which frankly did not surprise us, given the new focus on that program from the federal administration.
Right, nationally.
Immediately we were concerned. We were concerned about transparency again, which has continued to be an ongoing issue. And we were concerned about the sheriff's previous statement around cordwood and around enforcing the law with or without the help of the federal government.
Right.
And so we endeavored again to try to meet with him and express our concerns. And it has been a very similar situation where he's refused to meet with us.
Okay. And so you mentioned that this same program was implemented in Nashville, is that right?
Yes.
And you mentioned that there were some civil rights violations a part of that. Is that why it was unsuccessful in Nashville? And, you know, could you go into some detail on that?
I guess it depends on how you would define successful.
Okay.
So the study of what has happened in Nashville under 287G indicates that they deported about 10,000 people in a span of 5 years in which the program was operating. Now, the vast majority of the people that they deported were people who were detained on traffic violations and other minor misdemeanors. So if that is your definition of successful, then I guess you could say that you were. Nashville is very famous for having the case of Juana Villegas, who was a woman 9 months pregnant. She was arrested under the 287G program and processed. She ended up going into labor while she was in jail. She went through labor in shackles. They took off the shackles only so that she could give birth. Her child was taken away from her immediately after birth. She was taken back to jail. They didn't know where the baby was. She was denied access to a breast pump. She was denied access to medication. She ended up with a breast infection. And what happened ultimately is that Nashville was sued for medical negligence, essentially, and she won a judgment against them for nearly $500,000.
Good.
So that's, you know, that's not at all unusual with 287G.
And that's, I mean, that particular case is just inhumane. I mean, how terrible is that?
It's terrible. You know, as a mother myself, I can't imagine what would happen, how I would feel if my child were taken away from me and I didn't know where he was. But it's not at all unusual.
Right.
And we see that the 287G program is fraught with issues. Local taxpayers end up bearing the burdens, not just of any potential civil rights liability, but also we are paying for our local officers to enforce federal immigration laws. And that's time that they're not spending doing other things.
Right. And I'm correct to say that there are similar programs, if not identical, that have been in other cities across the country that have ended and have been unsuccessful. In our terms, I guess, unsuccessful. Is that right? So not just here in the state of Tennessee.
That's correct.
Okay.
You know, 287G is a program that was phased out, not entirely, but mostly under the Obama administration. Okay. And part of the reason why it was phased out was because of the gross record of civil rights violations. Right.
Well, Karen and Carla, this both goes to you. Outside of the direct impact, and this was actually a good segue to this, outside of the direct impact of jailing or deportation, what additional tolls does this program take on the immigrant community, both physically and psychologically? You know, for example, immigrants not feeling safe to leave their own homes. And for example, I do work at Centro Hispano, and after this 287G program was implemented, or I should say approved, there was a 40% drop in attendance for workshops and English learning courses out of fear and anxiety. So if you could speak to that, either of you.
Yes, just in the school systems around the area, I can say personally that there was a drop in attendance of Latino students, and knowing directly from the families that I work with, there were concerns about the safety of going to school. We had an incident where a parent was told that ICE was coming to school for her children, and that was an extremely frightening experience. It turned out to be not true, but there were several hours in there where a parent was afraid that she would never see her children again. Her children were afraid that they would never see their parents again. That's certainly not the environment you want happening at school.
No.
So there's immense psychological impacts on our children in our community. There's also just, it brings a sense of hopelessness to some of our students. I've had students say to me, well, what's the point of coming to school if I'm just going to get sent back to be killed anyway?
Wow.
Which is pretty dramatic. That's not something that your average K through 12 student should be thinking about.
Right. Yeah.
And just in trying to deal with that in a situation that most adults couldn't deal with, and you do see some behavior impacts as well. I've had children in my classroom crying on a regular basis, terrified that they're going to come home and their parents won't be there.
Are going to be gone. Yeah.
There are also concerns. We have school resource officers that can be very helpful in the school system, but with 287G, what will their relationship to our students be? That hasn't really been clarified for me as an educator or for our students. So is that something, do they have to be scared of this person in the hallway? Are they going to be a part of separating their family, or is this still an ally that they can go to if there's trouble going on? I've also received numerous phone calls from around the community from parents and families who have had various incidents of harassment or vandalism happening, and they're afraid to call the police because they're afraid that in reporting a crime against them, they could be subjecting their family to separation and actual lethal consequences, because for many of these families, they escaped from situations where they were under direct threat of being killed. My students have described seeing throat slit in front of them, seeing people shot, and knowing that they were going to be next. And so when that's the situation that you're looking at, you probably don't want to report vandalism or someone harassing you, because that pales in comparison with losing your life.
Well, and you know, this program, it's intended to affect the undocumented immigrants, but this affects immigrants in general, because they're not going to want to call the police if there is a break-in or whatever the case may be, because now there's this fear and anxiety. So this affects the entire immigrant community. And I don't know how much you can speak about this, but I understand that you've taken power of attorney over approximately 15 students. Is that correct, or can you confirm that?
Well, I can't talk about details for the safety of the students, but I do work to make sure that any of the families that I work with know that there are resources available to them. Just as a human being, I don't want any child that I care about to come home to an empty apartment and have no one there and not know how to get in touch with the parents, or not know where are they going to sleep that night, what are they going to eat for dinner. So I want any child that I work with to know that in the worst case scenario, they have someone to go to, they will have a home. I don't know how the logistics will work out, and I hope, frankly, that we never have to find out. But I do want families to have that assurance, and I think that's something that we need throughout the community for people to realize how widespread this issue is, and how what a big impact that is on a family. If you think about every night being together for dinner and not knowing if it's going to be the last time, and not knowing if you're going to be taken away and you can't protect your kids. So,
well, and can you just briefly explain what the power of attorney documentation is, what it does, just very briefly?
Yeah, so again, this is something where we don't know how this would all work out, because a lot of us working on this don't have legal experience. But working within the law, as we understand it, we're trying to make sure that if a child were to be without parental supervision, then someone could take charge of them, could make sure that they're enrolled in school, take them to the doctor, feed and clothe them, and take care of basic needs, and have the legal empowerment to do so.
And Carla, you're the co-chair of AKIN, so have you seen any examples of this, some of the psychological impacts, or even physical, not feeling safe to leave their own homes?
Yeah, I've heard of very many instances where people are actually starting to this is kind of an example. We have a friend who kind of installs Dish and DirecTV and stuff, and he's saying his business has been skyrocketing lately because people are very much prepared to kind of go into hibernation. So people, not hibernation, but you know what I mean, it sounds...
A prisoner on their own home.
Yeah, kind of just so they can avoid like going outside, and kind of like people who did not have cable or didn't have any sort of like TV service are kind of installing it. I know it's like a kind of a small example, but if I hear that from somebody, I mean, that's kind of a big... people are actually pretty much not going to go outside.
They're preparing to, again, be prisoners in their own home.
So,
well, that's really terrible to hear.
And I don't know if that's a kind of society that we want. People be in fear, or kind of hesitant to report crimes and stuff like that. I don't know if that's really their goal, is to kind of have people living in fear, regardless of immigration status. It's not good for the overall society and the workings of the society. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, and I've got a friend that her immigration attorney told them if it's non-essential travel, don't do it. Don't just go out and go on a joyride or go to the park. Don't do any of that. And you know, that's not a good standard of living. Go ahead.
I think the stories that Carla and Karen are sharing are indicative of exactly why there needs to be a bright line between local law enforcement and immigration officials.
Right.
We have, you know, Sheriff Jones has, in his limited contact with the media, speaking about 287G, has said that if you are not in the jail, you will never know that this program exists. And there are a couple of questions that we need to ask there. Number one, do people have reasonable fears to believe that either they or someone they love is going to be picked up by law enforcement? And number two, how do people end up in the law enforcement system? Are they stopped for driving without a license? Well, guess what? Undocumented folk can't get licenses.
Right.
Are they stopped for minor traffic violations? Exactly what happened in Nashville, exactly what's happened in other places that have had 287G, and then they're filtered into the system. So even though what happened was a minor traffic violation, they end up in the jail.
Right.
The jail then has the power to process them for detention and deportation.
Well, and off of that, even if the undocumented individual hasn't committed any type of minor violation even, we had a situation here in Knoxville just recently where an individual was hit in their car by someone else who was documented. So the undocumented individual was following all the traffic laws, doing everything that they were supposed to be, except having a license, because they couldn't get a license. They would love a license. And someone else who is documented violated traffic laws, hit them, and now we have a situation where police are on the scene. The undocumented individual is being questioned and asked to present their license. Now, because of 287G, does that mean that they're at risk for being separated from their family? Does that mean that they're at risk for being sent back to a potentially fatal situation when they did absolutely nothing wrong, not even a minor traffic violation?
Right, right. Well, and yeah, it's important to mention too that the immigrant community as a whole has a much lower rate of criminality and a much higher rate of entrepreneurship, so they're creating jobs. So they're not committing many crimes at all, and they're helping the economy. And like you say, you do the right things, you drive the way you should, but then someone else hits you and you could potentially be dragged away from your family. It's a terrible thing to really think about. As far as the impact of this program goes, I know that there's estimates between about 40,000 Latinos in Knox County. About 20,000 are documented and about 20,000 are undocumented. But again, racial profiling doesn't know documentation versus undocumented. So that's about 40,000 Latinos that could be targeted for racial profiling, for traffic stops, things like that. And there's also resettled refugees. So by the eye, if you just see someone that doesn't appear to be born and bred in East Tennessee, you might be a little bit more inclined to watch them a little closely, or more closely than you would me, for example. So that's a large swath of people that this program could potentially impact. Due to time constraints, I'm going to go ahead and move to our next topic, which is the failure of tuition opportunity legislation once again. And I actually have a friend who, I won't mention her name, but we've went to school together since elementary school. So elementary, middle, high school, very close friends. So she's every bit of a Knoxvillian or a Tennessean as I am. The only difference is she's a DACA recipient, so she doesn't have the accessibility to in-state tuition. And she doesn't come from a wealthy family, so without in-state tuition, it basically takes that option completely off the table. Now, luckily for her, she's a great person and really keeps her head held high and her shoulders back. So she's got a scholarship, so she now attends Johnson University and does very well there. But that's just a small story that I have personally. So this is to Karen and Carla again. Just can you give us a brief overview of the goal of this legislation, a little more in depth than what I said about, you know, clearly not giving in-state tuition to undocumented immigrant children, and maybe some of the details involved, just very briefly.
I think the goal of it is the American dream, of course. I mean, it was, I actually spoke at the committee where they were going to vote this past April, and any opposing argument there was no good opposing argument to it, mostly probably out of ignorance and mostly out of kind of anti-immigrant ideology.
Right.
At the end of the day, the tuition opportunity bill, or if it were to be passed, it was just going to create revenue for the state. Ultimately, it wasn't going to cost anyone a penny.
Really?
It was going to, basically people were going to be able to go to college at the rate that they're supposed to, because most of these people actually pay taxes. I mean, not that, not trying to throw anyone under the bus or anything. Everyone pays taxes. At the end of the day, no one gets out alive without paying any taxes. Right?
Yeah,
so,
right.
I mean, people already pay taxes. Out-of-state tuition is essentially a tax for not living in the state and not putting money into the state. These students are putting money into the state, many of them who have jobs and pay, Social Security and all that. So, I mean, basically, it was not going to cost anybody a penny. They're going to be able to go to school at the rate everyone else does. So, I mean, I just know a lot of people who want to be able to, even join the military and want to be able to go to school after that. And I always think about my kind of like what I want to do, but I never think about what other people sometimes. And being there kind of opened my eyes to like there's so many people that want to do so many different things, and who knows if they'll be able to now. I mean, not everyone is as lucky as some. I mean, not everyone has the same opportunity. So in-state tuition was just the one thing that was very easy, honestly, very easy, and it was just kind of.
And Representative Eddie Smith, I believe, was the decisive vote against that, and what killed that bill. And he is Knoxville's representative. So this goes to you, Karen. How would the passage of this legislation impact your Latino students? Because you're a local educator, I'm sure you have Latino students in your classroom.
It would have massive implications, because we put so much emphasis on making students college and career ready. And so all through school, they're working towards gaining the skills and the knowledge necessary to be successful in life. And for them to hit their senior year and then all of a sudden be told, oh, well, actually, we weren't talking about you, because it's unreachable to pay out-of-state tuition, especially when you've, like Carla mentioned, you've been paying in-state taxes your entire life. Your whole family has been. And so to all of a sudden have that abrupt dead end is unreasonable, in my opinion. And
unfair. I mean,
it is. Approximately half of the students I work with were actually in Nashville at the same time as Carla when the bill was being voted on. And so they've studied the U.S. legislative system, the government system in school, and really had an amazing opportunity to be involved in it more than a lot of our students. And they're very passionate about learning about the issue and talking with legislators to say this directly affects me and my future, and I want to have education, I want to have a good life. And so for a lot of them to be in that room when the legislators, including Eddie Smith, then voted no and essentially said your story doesn't matter. They came back to Knoxville kind of stunned, sort of reeling from that experience, that that they were told that they didn't matter, that the system that they had learned about to create legislation that represented the people of Knoxville and the people of Tennessee didn't work for them. So that was a hard life lesson.
I'm sure it was. And Carla, since you were so heavily involved in this fight really for tuition opportunity, I'm sure you have close ties with students of undocumented immigrants. Could you tell us, based on your experiences with them, how this legislation, if it was passed, would have impacted their lives? Maybe you heard some stories there.
Yes, I mean, meeting so many, this past, what was it? Back in April when I met so many of them, it was just, they would be able to go to school, I mean, at the same rate, and be able to go on to jobs that would in turn just make more money and put more money into the state, and I mean, just be able to kind of live that American dream.
It's hard to do anything now without a college education, any job that gets a lot of money. And finally, and this is really to Carla mainly, if any of the legislators are watching, and this is because you were so heavily involved and you have these personal connections, if any of the legislators who voted no are watching tonight, what would you say to them?
And basically that any opposing argument wasn't very good and it wasn't very well thought out and there wasn't any facts behind it. At the end of the day, the bill had a positive fiscal note, so there was no reason to not pass it.
Right, right. And these are people's lives.
I mean, those are people's lives, yeah, and if you want to look at it at a very, you know, economic standpoint, if you want to be very kind of, you know, fiscally kind of about it, then at the end of the day it was just not going to cost anyone a single penny. But there's a lot of misconceptions on the bill, that the bill is a discounted rate and blah blah blah, and it's like, no, it's not. Just at the end of the day, you have to look at the facts, and those are the facts. So it's smart fiscally and it's smart morally and ethically. Exactly, so there's really no reason to vote against that that legislation. Now, again, due to time constraints, we're going to go ahead and move on to our last topic, which is the lawsuit against the federal government if the DACA Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program is not ended, which again would be catastrophic. Megan, can you just give us a little background on this lawsuit? I know there's not much information floating around out there, but what you do know, could you tell us? Well,
I'll just say briefly that 10 attorneys general and I think it's the governor of Idaho filed a lawsuit against the federal government to end Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the DACA program. And one of those attorneys general was here in Tennessee, Herbert Slattery.
Okay.
So the idea is to force the president to cancel the DACA program. And if he does not, if he declines to do so, they will sue him. He has until September 5th to make a decision. September 5th,
okay. And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't this similar tactic, or possibly identical tactic, used to end the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans program, DAPA? Wasn't this same sort of tactic used there, which ultimately was successful in ending that program?
Yes and no.
Okay.
The DAPA program was, states did sue over DAPA. I think it was 26 states that were involved in that lawsuit. And what happened was the policy was temporarily enjoined by a lower court. It went up to the Supreme Court. They had a 4-4 tie. They pushed it back to local courts. And basically what eventually happened is January of this year came, and the Trump administration declined to pursue the lawsuit. So they did not support DAPA in the courts. Otherwise, it might have been argued eventually, and it may have had a different outcome entirely. We don't know.
And very briefly, what gives you the confidence that the same result that happened to DAPA will not befall DACA?
I don't have that confidence at all.
Oh, really? Okay. Well,
yeah, DACA was signed into law as an executive order. It can be done. It can be undone with an executive order. It can be undone with a lawsuit.
Right. Well, and then on that, what would the results be if this DACA program was ended? And this goes to any of you because you're all very intelligent on this impact.
Well, I don't know if this goes directly to your question, but I do want to issue a challenge to viewers and to legislators to please think about a child in your life, someone that you have known your entire life, their entire life, that is very precious to you. And think about that child asking you, why do people hate me for wanting to live? That's a question that I was asked this November by one of my students. I don't know how to answer that question, and I think that we have a responsibility as a community and as a country to respond to that child.
We do. And we're out of time. So I just want to thank my guests, really phenomenal people, and they're doing so much good work. We're going to have the websites for Allies of Knoxville's Immigrant Neighbors, AKIN, as well as Centro Hispano. If you want to get involved, if anything that was said in this conversation moved you, please stand up, speak out, go on these websites and learn more information, how you can get involved. We need your help. These are human lives at stake. So again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you here next week.